The shattered illusion. The soft golden glow of chandeliers reflected off the polished mahogany floors of Le Papillon, New York City's most exclusive fine dining establishment. The restaurant exuded elegance, with the subtle scent of fresh flowers intermingling with the tantalizing aroma of gourmet dishes. It was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where whispers of million-dollar deals mingled with the clinking of crystal glasses. For Emily Harris, however, it was more than a job. It was her escape. 7 years had passed since her husband, Daniel, had been declared dead in a tragic accident. 7 years of mourning, of rebuilding, of piecing together the fragments of her shattered existence. Every morning, she would rise, put on her crisp black and white uniform, and paint on a smile before stepping into a world of opulence. It wasn't her world. It was a performance, a facade that allowed her to survive. Emily moved effortlessly between the tables that evening, her hand steady and her smile practiced. She approached a table of 4, their laughter bubbling like the champagne they sipped. "Would you like another bottle, sir?" she asked, her voice smooth and professional. "Yes, please," replied the man at the table, barely glancing at her as he resumed his conversation. Emily nodded and turned to head toward the bar, when a sound behind her caused her to pause. The maitre d', her colleague of 5 years, was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone near the entrance. Curiosity tugged at her, but she dismissed it. Guests often arrived late or unannounced, and it wasn't her concern. She focused on retrieving the champagne bottle and maneuvered back through the sea of tables. That's when she saw him. It was a face she knew better than her own. The face of the man she had loved, mourned, and buried in her heart. The tray in her hands trembled as her pulse quickened. She froze, her gaze locked on him. Daniel. The tray slipped from her grasp, and the restaurant fell silent as champagne flutes shattered on the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the room, and the diners turned to look, some murmuring their disapproval. Emily barely noticed. Her breath hitched, her vision blurring as a tide of emotions surged within her. He looked exactly the same. Tousled brown hair, piercing green eyes, and the crooked smile that had once melted her heart. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, his hands casually in his pockets, as if he hadn't just stepped into her meticulously constructed life like a ghost. Emily's manager hurried to her side, whispering urgently, "Emily, are you all right? Let me handle this." But she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She watched as Daniel scanned the room, his eyes landing on her. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign that he knew her. He nodded politely, as one does to a stranger, and then turned to follow the maitre d' to a table in the corner. Her heart shattered anew. How could he not know her? How could he stand there, alive and well, when she had spent years grieving him? Her legs wobbled, and she reached for the edge of the nearest table to steady herself. "Emily," her manager urged again, his voice tinged with concern. "Take a break. I'll clean this up." She nodded mechanically and stumbled toward the staff room, her vision still fixed on Daniel, until the door closed behind her. Leaning against the wall, she pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the storm within her. It didn't make sense. 7 years ago, she had identified his body after the accident. She had held the cold hand of a man who had been pronounced dead. Yet there he was, as alive as ever, looking at her as if she were a stranger. Emily didn't know how long she sat in the break room, her mind a chaotic swirl of questions and memories. The image of Daniel's face wouldn't leave her. Her mind raced back to the accident, to the call from the hospital that had changed her life. She had been told he was gone, that his car had plunged into a ravine during a rainstorm. The body recovered from the wreckage had been unrecognizable, but the wedding ring on his finger had been unmistakable. So how was he here? The door creaked open, and her coworker, Mia, peeked inside. "Hey, are you okay?" That was intense. Emily forced a smile, though her hands were trembling. "I'm fine. Just slipped, that's all." Mia didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. "All right. Just take your time." The manager says he'll cover for you for the rest of the night if you need. Emily nodded, grateful for the reprieve. Once Maya left, she buried her face in her hands. Her thoughts oscillated between disbelief and desperation. She needed answers. She needed to confront him. Summoning her courage, she returned to the dining room. The shattered glass had been cleaned up, and the soft hum of conversation had resumed. She scanned the room, her eyes locking onto Daniel. He was sitting at the corner table, speaking with an older man in a business suit. They appeared to be discussing something serious, their expressions calm yet focused. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. Every step toward him felt like walking a tightrope. As she approached, his companion looked up and gave her a polite smile. Daniel followed his gaze, his green eyes meeting hers. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. I think there's been a mistake." Daniel tilted his head, his expression curious but unbothered. "A mistake?" "Yes," Emily said, her throat dry. Do you know who I am?" He studied her for a moment, his brows furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" The words cut through her like a blade. Her vision blurred, but she refused to falter. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's me, Emily." His brow furrowed deeper, and he leaned forward, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to confusion. "I think you must have me confused with someone else," he said gently. "My name is David Carter." Her breath hitched. David Carter. No, this wasn't possible. But before she could respond, the older man at the table interjected. "Is everything all right, David?" he asked, his tone protective. "Yes, Daniel," David replied, still watching Emily with a concerned expression. "It's fine. Just a misunderstanding." Emily felt the room spinning. She muttered an apology and retreated, her face burning with humiliation and heartbreak. As she disappeared into the staff room once more, the weight of the encounter threatened to crush her. Had she made a mistake? Was it possible he wasn't Daniel after all? Or was there something far more sinister at play? One thing was certain: her carefully rebuilt world had been shattered, and she was determined to uncover the truth. The ghost of the past. Emily sat in the dimly lit break room of Le Papillon, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of untouched coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, but she couldn't bring herself to take a sip. Her mind was too consumed with the impossible. Daniel, or whoever he claimed to be, was alive. The man she had loved, mourned, and buried was sitting in the dining room, speaking to another man with a composed expression, as if the past 7 years had never happened. She replayed the moment in her mind over and over again, trying to make sense of it. His voice, his mannerisms, even the way he tilted his head when confused. It was all him. And yet, when she had confronted him, he looked at her with the eyes of a stranger, claiming his name was David Carter. David Carter. The name felt foreign and wrong on her lips. Emily pulled out her phone with shaky fingers, typing the name into the search bar. Pages of results appeared, but none of them seemed to match the man sitting outside. There were business profiles, social media accounts, and news articles, but nothing concrete. The frustration gnawed at her, each unanswered question piling onto the weight in her chest. Was it possible he had somehow lost his memory? Had he faked his death and assumed a new identity? Or worse, had she been wrong all along? No, she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. She had identified his body, planned his funeral, and grieved for years. It couldn't have been a mistake. Someone was lying. Whether it was him or someone else, she was determined to find out. A knock on the break room door startled her. She looked up to see Mia standing in the doorway, concern etched across her face. "Emily, are you sure you're okay? You've been in here for a while," Maya asked gently. Emily forced a weak smile. "I just needed a minute. I'm fine, really." Mia stepped closer, crossing her arms. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but if you need to talk, I'm here." For a brief moment, Emily considered telling her everything. But how could she explain something so impossible without sounding crazy? Instead, she just nodded. "Thanks, Mia. I appreciate it." Mia hesitated, then gave a soft squeeze of Emily's shoulder before leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. With a deep breath, Emily stood up, smoothing her uniform. She couldn't hide here all night. She needed to face this head-on. Steeling herself, she walked back into the dining area, her heart pounding with each step. The hum of conversation surrounded her, the clinking of glasses and silverware filling the air. But Emily's focus was singular. She walked straight to the table where Daniel, or David, sat. He was mid-conversation with his companion when he noticed her approaching. His expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, or just curiosity. "Excuse me, sir," Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm inside. I need to speak with you privately." The older man at the table frowned. "Is there a problem?" Daniel, no David, studied her carefully before offering a charming smile. "It's all right," he said smoothly. "Give me a moment." He stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket, and followed Emily toward the side hallway leading to the private event rooms. Once they were away from prying eyes, Emily turned to face him, her composure slipping. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" David, or Daniel, sighed, his expression unreadable. "I'm not sure what you mean." Emily's eyes welled with tears of frustration. "Stop lying to me. I know who you are, Daniel. You died. 7 years ago. I buried you. And now you're standing here, pretending you don't know me." He hesitated, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I think you're mistaken," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "I don't know you." Emily clenched her fists. "You're lying." David, or Daniel, ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "Look, I don't want to upset you. I don't know what you think you know, but I'm David Carter. I run a financial consulting firm, and I've never met you before tonight." The certainty in his tone shook her. She searched his face for any sign, any crack in his mask, but it was flawless. If this was an act, it was a damn good one. "Then tell me," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Where were you 7 years ago?" David hesitated, and for a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt? Doubt? "I was overseas," he answered finally, "traveling for business." Emily shook her head. "I don't believe you." A strained silence hung between them before David exhaled sharply. "Look, I'm sorry you're going through this. Maybe it's a case of mistaken identity, but I swear, I'm not the man you think I am." Emily's breath hitched as he turned to leave. "If you're not him," she said, her voice trembling, "then why do you look exactly like my husband?" He paused for a moment but didn't turn around. "Sometimes the past plays tricks on us," he said quietly, and then he walked away, leaving Emily standing in the dimly lit hallway, her world spinning. That night, Emily sat in her small apartment, surrounded by old photo albums and memories she thought she had locked away for good. She traced her fingers over an old wedding photo, Daniel's smile wide and genuine, as they stood in the sunlight, her hand in his. She pulled out the police report, the hospital records, everything she had collected over the years. The accident had been ruled an unfortunate tragedy, no foul play suspected. But now she wasn't so sure. A chilling thought crossed her mind. What if Daniel's death had been a lie? What if he had faked it and walked away from their life? And if so, why? Unraveling the mystery. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers gripping the edges of a worn leather photo album. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across her small apartment, turning the familiar space into something cold and unfamiliar. Scattered across the bed were remnants of a life she had spent years trying to put behind her. Photographs, old letters, Daniel's watch she had tucked away in the back of a drawer, too painful to look at, yet impossible to throw away. Her mind refused to rest. She flipped through the pages of the album, her eyes tracing every detail of Daniel's face in the photographs. His broad smile, the way his green eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the small dimple that always appeared when he was deep in thought. It was him. There was no doubt in her mind. So why did he pretend otherwise? Emily's pulse quickened as she thought back to their confrontation at the restaurant. The certainty in his voice, the way he held himself, there had been no hesitation, no slip in his story. But the flicker in his eyes, that brief hesitation when she pressed him about the past, that had been real. "I know it's you, Daniel," she whispered to the empty room. "I know it." A deep sense of determination took hold of her. She had spent the last 7 years surviving, burying herself in work, and trying to move forward. But if there was even the slightest chance that Daniel was alive and lying, she had to find out the truth. Without hesitation, she reached for her laptop and opened a blank search bar. Her fingers hovered over the keys before she typed in the name he had given her, David Carter. Several generic profiles popped up. LinkedIn accounts, social media profiles, a few mentions in financial publications, but nothing that screamed a past as complicated as Daniel's. She clicked on the most promising link, a professional website for Carter and Associates, a financial consultancy firm based in New York. The website was sleek and professional, with a polished photo of him at the top of the About Us page. David Carter, founder and CEO. Her breath hitched as she stared at the photo. It was him. Clean-shaven, wearing a sharp suit, but it was undeniably Daniel. The bio beneath the image was vague, mentioning years of experience in international finance and investments, but no personal details. No mention of family. No mention of a past. Emily clicked on the contact page, jotting down the listed office address before moving to his social media accounts. They were curated, filled with professional updates, industry news, and the occasional travel photo. But there were no personal connections, no friends, no tagged photos, nothing that suggested he had a life outside of work. "Who are you now?" she murmured, frustration building inside her. She needed more. Something concrete. Her thoughts drifted back to the restaurant earlier that evening. The man Daniel, David, was with. The older gentleman had looked important, authoritative. Maybe he held the key to this mystery. Grabbing her phone, she pulled up the reservation log from the restaurant's system. As a senior waitress, she had access to guest details, a privilege she had never abused. Until now. Scrolling through the reservations for the night, her heart pounded when she saw it. David Carter, party of 2. Accompanying the reservation was the name Richard Langley. Emily's eyes widened. Richard Langley was a name she recognized. He was a well-known venture capitalist, a man with deep ties to powerful people and an even deeper pocket. What was Daniel, David, doing with someone like him? Her fingers hovered over the phone before she typed a quick search. Richard Langley, New York Business Ventures. Articles filled the screen, most detailing his latest investments and high-profile deals. But one headline caught her attention. Langley and Carter. The next big financial power move. Emily's stomach twisted. They were partners. She clicked on the article and scanned through the contents. It discussed their new joint venture, focusing on high-risk investments overseas, but it was the final paragraph that made her blood run cold. David Carter has maintained a notoriously private life, despite his rising success, with very little known about his past before his rapid climb in the finance world 5 years ago. Speculations remain about his sudden emergence in the industry, but his results speak for themselves. Emily's mind reeled. 5 years ago. That was 2 years after Daniel's supposed death. She sat back, chewing on her lower lip. The timeline fit too perfectly to be coincidence. Somehow, Daniel, or whoever he was now, had resurfaced in a completely different world, cutting ties with everything he once had. And the question that haunted her most, why? The next morning, Emily took a deep breath as she stood in front of the gleaming glass doors of Carter and Associates. The towering skyscraper loomed above her, reflecting the cloudy sky. Her hands clenched into fists as she mustered the courage to step inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, with sharp lines and minimalist decor. A polished receptionist greeted her with a professional smile. "Welcome to Carter and Associates. How may I help you?" Emily cleared her throat, forcing confidence into her voice. "I'm here to see David Carter. I'm an old acquaintance, and I was hoping to speak with him." The receptionist's polite smile faltered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's important," Emily pressed. "I won't take much of his time." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. After a few whispered words, she nodded and looked back at Emily. "Mr. Carter is in a meeting at the moment, but if you'd like to leave your name and contact information, I can pass it along." Emily bit her lip, considering her options. Leaving her name could tip him off, but it might also force him to confront her. She scribbled down her name and number before turning to leave. As she did, she caught a glimpse of him through the glass walls of a nearby conference room. David, stood at the head of a table, addressing a group of executives with the same quiet confidence she had fallen in love with years ago. Her heart ached at the sight, but then something caught her eye. Something she hadn't noticed before. As he gestured, his sleeve slid up slightly, revealing a faint scar along his wrist. Emily's breath hitched. It was a scar she knew intimately, one he had gotten when they went hiking on their honeymoon, and he had slipped, cutting himself on a jagged rock. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the reception desk. It was him. There was no denying it now. Tears welled in her eyes as realization hit her with full force. He had faked his death, and whatever reason he had, it was big enough to make him leave behind everything they had. Beneath the surface, Emily stood frozen outside the glass doors of Carter and Associates, her pulse pounding in her ears. The scar. It was the final confirmation she needed. No amount of denial or carefully crafted lies could change what she had seen. Daniel, her husband, was alive, and he had walked away from their life as if it had never existed. The wind whipped through the New York streets, tugging at her coat, but she barely felt the cold. She turned away from the towering skyscraper, her mind racing with questions that refused to settle. Why had he left? Why had he let her believe he was dead? And most importantly, who was he now? Emily's heels clicked against the pavement as she made her way to a nearby cafe, desperate for a moment to collect her thoughts. She slid into a corner booth and ordered a coffee, her hands trembling as she took out her phone. The contact information she had left at the front desk nodded her. Would he call? Would he ignore her? Would he finally give her the answers she needed? She wasn't willing to wait. With a determined breath, Emily scrolled through her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Detective Raymond Carter, an old friend of Daniel's from the force. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. Carter. Ray, it's Emily. A brief pause. Emily. Hey, it's been a long time. How are you holding up? She hesitated, the weight of her words pressing against her chest. I need your help. His tone shifted instantly, years of experience picking up on the urgency in her voice. What's going on? It's Daniel. Another pause, longer this time. Emily, Daniel's gone. You know that. No, Ray. Her voice cracked. He's alive. I saw him. There was silence on the other end, followed by a cautious sigh. Emily, that's not possible. I'm not crazy, she insisted. I saw him with my own eyes. He's living under a new name, David Carter. He's running a financial firm here in the city. I need you to look into it. Ray exhaled sharply. This is a lot. You're saying he faked his death. Why would he do that? I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I need to find out. A beat of silence. Then, all right. I'll pull some records and see what I can find. Thank you, Ray. She hung up and leaned back in her seat, staring blankly out the window as the city bustled around her. 3 days passed with no word from Daniel or David, as he now called himself. Emily found herself consumed by the mystery, spending hours combing through his business records, trying to piece together the life he had built without her. Carter and Associates was legitimate, but there were gaps in his history that didn't add up. No records before 5 years ago, vague references to previous experience, and an almost obsessive effort to keep his private life hidden. Then, late one night, her phone buzzed. "Ray Carter, meet me at O'Malley's. I found something." Emily's heart leaped into her throat. She quickly grabbed her coat and hurried through the chilly streets to the familiar Irish pub where she and Daniel had spent many evenings years ago. The place hadn't changed. Same worn leather booths, same smoky atmosphere, and the same comforting smell of fried food and whiskey. Ray was sitting in a corner booth, his expression grim. A thick folder lay in front of him, and he gestured for her to sit. "You were right," he said without preamble. "David Carter doesn't exist before 5 years ago. But what's more concerning is where Daniel Harris disappeared to after his death." Emily swallowed hard. "Where?" Ray opened the file, revealing a series of documents. Travel records, offshore bank accounts, and a series of photographs that made Emily's stomach twist. He went off the grid for 2 years. No trace, no activity. Then, suddenly, he resurfaces in Europe under this new identity, working with some very questionable people. Emily's eyes scanned the documents, her blood running cold. What kind of people? Ray leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "International finance, Emily, but not the clean kind. We're talking money laundering, shell corporations, front companies. Whatever he's into, it's big, and it's dangerous." Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the evidence. A photo of Daniel, or David, walking through an airport in Zurich, another of him shaking hands with a shadowy figure whose face was blurred out. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Daniel was a cop. He wouldn't." Ray cut her off. "He was a cop, Em. But people change. Maybe he got in over his head." Emily's heart ached at the thought. Had Daniel been forced into this? Had he faked his death to protect her? Or had he willingly stepped into this new life, leaving her behind without a second thought? She closed the file slowly. "I need to confront him." Ray sighed. "Emily, if he's mixed up in something dangerous, you need to be careful. People who fake their deaths don't do it for fun." "I don't care," she said firmly. "I have to know the truth." The next day, Emily arrived outside Carter and Associates once again, this time with renewed determination. She waited near the building's entrance until she saw him step out, his suit crisp, his hair perfectly styled. Taking a deep breath, she approached him. "Daniel." He froze, his expression carefully neutral. "Emily," he said quietly, glancing around nervously. "You shouldn't be here." "I deserve answers," she shot back, stepping closer. "Why did you do this? Why did you leave me?" His jaw tightened. "Not here." He glanced over his shoulder. "Follow me." Emily followed him down a side street to a quiet cafe, the tension between them thick and heavy. As they sat, he leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "I never meant for you to find out," he admitted. "It was safer that way." "Safer?" she echoed, anger flaring. "You let me think you were dead, Daniel. 7 years of my life, wasted, mourning you. Why?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I had to disappear, Em. The people I was investigating. They were dangerous. If I hadn't faked my death, they would have come after you too." Emily's breath caught. "So you just walked away?" David nodded. "I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. And when I built this new life, I convinced myself it was better this way." Tears burned in Emily's eyes. "You don't get to decide what's better for me." "I know," he said softly. "And I'm sorry." She studied him, searching for the man she had loved, the man she still loved. "Is it over? Are you safe?" He hesitated. "I don't know." Emily shook her head, wiping at her eyes. "I can't just pretend you're not alive, Daniel. I need the truth." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Then let me explain everything." And as Emily looked into his familiar green eyes, she realized that the truth she had been searching for was only the beginning of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Shadows and secrets. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he held Emily's across the cafe table. For a man who once seemed unshakable, he now looked like a ghost of himself, haunted, worn, and utterly vulnerable. His words hung in the air like a fragile thread, promising answers yet to be revealed. Emily sat back, crossing her arms, the emotions she'd buried for years now clawing their way to the surface. She wasn't sure whether to cry, scream, or simply walk away. But she had come too far to leave without the truth. "Start from the beginning," she said, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "No lies. No half-truths. I need to know everything." Daniel nodded, his gaze darting to the window as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "It started with a case," he began, his voice low. "About a year before I left." Emily stiffened. She had always known Daniel to be a dedicated detective, someone who would chase justice no matter the personal cost. But this case, whatever it was, had clearly consumed him. "I was investigating a series of financial crimes," he continued. "Money laundering, embezzlement, things that didn't seem connected at first. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized it all pointed to one organization. Powerful, untouchable." Emily's brow furrowed. "What organization?" Daniel hesitated, glancing around the cafe before leaning closer. "They call themselves the Dominion. They operate globally. Shell companies, offshore accounts, black market dealings. They're everywhere, but you'll never find their name in any official record." The name sent a chill down Emily's spine. "And you were investigating them?" He nodded. "At first, I didn't even realize how deep it went. I thought it was just another white-collar crime ring. But then I got too close, closer than anyone had before. And they knew it." "What happened?" Daniel's eyes darkened. "They sent a message. One of my informants turned up dead. His family, too. They didn't leave any room for interpretation. If I kept digging, you'd be next." Emily's breath caught. The idea that her life had been in danger, even without her knowing, sent a wave of nausea through her. "So you decided to disappear." "It was the only way," he said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't protect you if I stayed. And I couldn't walk away from the case, not when I was so close to exposing them. So I faked my death, took what I knew, and went underground." She shook her head, struggling to process it all. "And what about now? What are you doing with Carter and Associates? Is it connected to them?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Carter and Associates is a front. I built it to get close to their operations, to gather evidence without raising suspicion. Langley, my partner, is connected to the Dominion. He doesn't know I'm watching him." Emily's stomach churned. "You're still chasing them? After all these years?" "I have to," Daniel said, his voice firm. "They've ruined too many lives. They don't get to win." Her hands clenched into fists. "And what about me? You let me think you were dead for 7 years, Daniel. You don't get to decide that I can't be a part of your life anymore." "I didn't have a choice," he said, his tone pleading. "If they knew you were alive, if they thought I had any weakness, they'd come after you in a heartbeat." Emily's eyes burned with tears. "Do you have any idea what it was like, Daniel? Losing you, thinking I'd never see you again." His expression crumbled. "I thought about you every day, Em. It killed me to leave you. But I couldn't let them hurt you. I couldn't let them take you from me." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of 7 years pressing down on them. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice resolute. "I want to help." Daniel's eyes widened. "No, absolutely not." "I'm not asking," she shot back. "You've made every decision for us since this started, Daniel. But I'm here now, and I'm not walking away. If you're still in danger, then so am I. So let me help." He hesitated, clearly torn between his instincts to protect her and the reality of their situation. Finally, he sighed. "There's a meeting tomorrow. Langley and some of the Dominion's key players will be there. If I can get the evidence I need, this could all be over." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "Then we'll do it together." The next evening, Emily found herself dressed in an elegant black gown, her nerves on edge as she walked arm in arm with Daniel, or David, as he was still publicly known, into an exclusive gala at one of New York's most luxurious hotels. The event was a cover for a high-stakes meeting, where Langley and his associates would discuss their next moves. Daniel's grip on her arm was firm, a silent reminder to stay calm. "Just follow my lead," he murmured. The room was a dazzling display of wealth and power, with glittering chandeliers and well-dressed attendees sipping champagne. Emily felt out of place, but kept her head high, determined to play her part. Daniel guided her to a quiet corner where Langley stood, surrounded by a small group of men in tailored suits. Langley's sharp eyes flicked to Emily, and a polite smile tugged at his lips. "David," he greeted, extending a hand. "Good to see you. And who's this lovely lady?" "My wife, Emily," Daniel said smoothly, the lies slipping out effortlessly. "She insisted on joining me tonight." Langley's smile widened. "A pleasure, Mrs. Carter." Emily forced a smile, shaking his hand. "The pleasure's mine." As the men continued their conversation, Emily scanned the room, her eyes landing on a table near the back where several laptops and documents were laid out. She recognized one of the men seated there from race photos, a known associate of the Dominion. Her pulse quickened. This was it. "Excuse me," she said, slipping away from the group under the pretense of getting a drink. Daniel caught her eye, his expression tense but understanding. Emily weaved through the crowd, her heart pounding as she approached the table. She pulled a small flash drive from her clutch, her hands trembling as she subtly connected it to one of the laptops. Seconds felt like hours as she waited for the data to transfer, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching. Just as the progress bar reached 100%, a hand clamped down on her wrist. "Going somewhere?" Emily spun around, her breath catching as she came face to face with one of Langley's bodyguards. "I was just..." Before she could finish, Daniel appeared, his voice cold and authoritative. "Is there a problem here?" The bodyguard hesitated, releasing her wrist. "No, sir, just keeping an eye out." Daniel nodded curtly, taking Emily's arm and guiding her away. "What were you thinking?" he hissed once they were out of earshot. "I got it," she whispered, holding up the flash drive. His expression softened, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Let's get out of here." But as they headed for the exit, Langley's voice rang out behind them. "David, leaving so soon?" Emily's blood ran cold as she turned to see Langley watching them, his polite smile now edged with suspicion. And in that moment, she knew the game they were playing had just become far more dangerous. The edge of deception. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to face Langley, his eyes sharp and assessing. The murmur of the gala buzzed around them, but in that moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the three of them, her, Daniel, and the man who could ruin everything. Daniel's grip on her arm tightened, a subtle warning. "We were just heading out," he said smoothly, his voice calm and confident. "It's been a long evening." Langley stepped closer, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Leaving early? That's not like you, David." His gaze flickered to Emily. "Surely your lovely wife would want to enjoy the night a little longer." Emily forced a smile, feeling the weight of his stare. "Oh, I've had my fill of champagne and small talk," she replied lightly. "Besides, my husband promised me a quiet night after this." Langley chuckled, but there was an unmistakable edge in his tone. "David, you've been awfully distracted tonight. Something on your mind?" Daniel didn't miss a beat. "Just business, as always." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. In fact, I was going to talk to you tomorrow. Privately. Langley's eyes gleamed with interest. I see. Something urgent. You could say that. Daniel gave him a tight smile. I'll stop by your office. Langley nodded slowly. I'll be expecting you. Emily held her breath until they were outside the Grand Hotel, the cool night air hitting her face like a wave of relief. Are we clear? She whispered as they hurried down the street, blending into the bustling city crowd. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. For now. But we have to move fast. They hailed a cab, and once inside, Daniel's calm facade shattered. What the hell were you thinking, Emily? That was reckless. I got the data, she shot back, holding up the flash drive. Isn't that what we needed? Yes, but you have no idea how dangerous these people are. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. Langley suspects something now. He's going to be watching us. Emily swallowed hard. Then we have to make this count. Daniel sighed, his expression softening. You did good, Em. But from now on, we play this my way. She nodded, tucking the flash drive securely into her clutch. What's our next move? Back at Daniel's penthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Emily sat on the couch as Daniel plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he decrypted the files. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the computer. Then, Daniel's face darkened. This is bigger than I thought, he murmured, scrolling through a list of offshore accounts and coded transactions. They've got connections everywhere. Banks, politicians, law enforcement. Emily leaned over, her eyes scanning the screen. Can we take this to the authorities? Daniel shook his head. Not yet. If we go to the wrong person, we could tip them off. We need to be sure. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and a new message popped up. Nice try, David. We see you. Emily's blood ran cold. They know. Daniel slammed the laptop shut. We have to leave. Now. Before Emily could respond, the building's alarm blared through the penthouse. A red light flashed on the security panel by the door. They're here, Daniel said, grabbing her hand. Come on. They sprinted out of the apartment, Daniel leading her down a back staircase just as heavy footsteps echoed from above. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they burst out into a dark alley. Daniel pulled her behind a dumpster, pressing a hand over her mouth to keep her quiet as men in dark suits swept the street, their voices low and urgent. After what felt like an eternity, the men moved on, and Daniel exhaled in relief. We need to get out of the city. Emily nodded, trying to steady her breathing. Where can we go? I know a place, he said, his jaw set with determination. But we have to go now. They won't stop until they find us. Hours later, they arrived at a small cabin deep in the woods outside the city. It was a stark contrast to Daniel's sleek penthouse, rugged, isolated, and quiet. He lit a fire in the stone hearth while Emily paced anxiously. I still don't understand, she said finally. If you've been watching them for years, why haven't you taken them down? Daniel sat down heavily. Because I never had proof that could hold up in court. But now, he gestured to the flash drive. This is it. Emily sank into a chair across from him, exhaustion creeping into her bones. So what do we do? Daniel's eyes met hers. We finish what I started. We expose them. Together. A sense of determination settled over Emily. Despite the fear, despite the heartbreak, she knew she couldn't walk away now. I'm with you, she said firmly. Daniel reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Then let's end this. But deep down, Emily knew the fight was only just beginning. And the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The final confrontation. The flickering fire cast long, trembling shadows across the cabin walls. But Emily's mind was sharper than it had been in years. Every second that passed felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge of what lay ahead. She sat across from Daniel at the worn wooden table, the stolen flash drive between them like a loaded gun. Outside, the wind whispered through the dense trees, their seclusion both a blessing and a curse. "We can't stay here forever," Emily said finally, breaking the thick silence. "Langley won't stop looking for us." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. He had changed in so many ways, but that familiar look of determination was still there. The same look he had when he used to chase down criminals, believing in justice above all else. "No, we can't, but we have enough now to strike first." Emily leaned forward. "How?" "We can't trust the authorities, and we don't have enough resources to take them on alone." Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the table. "There's someone I know, someone who's been waiting for an opportunity like this." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze dark. "Ray Lawson, an investigative journalist I used to work with before everything fell apart. If anyone can blow this wide open without getting silenced, it's him." Emily considered it. "You trust him?" "With my life." Emily nodded, the weight of the decision settling in. "Then we find him." A dangerous alliance. 3 hours later, they arrived at a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. Emily's hands were cold despite the heat of the car, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She stole a glance at Daniel, who sat beside her in tense silence, his eyes scanning every vehicle and passerby. "Are you sure he's going to show?" she asked. "He will," Daniel said. "He doesn't let things go." Just as he spoke, the door to the diner creaked open, and a man in his late 40s stepped in, his eyes darting across the room before landing on them. He had the weary look of someone who had seen too much, and Emily felt an immediate kinship with him. Daniel stood and motioned him over. "Ray." Ray slid into the booth, his expression grim. "You shouldn't have contacted me, Carter. They're watching everyone." "They're already after us," Daniel said, placing the flash drive on the table between them. "But we have what you need to take them down." Ray stared at the drive, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Do you have any idea how many people have tried and failed to do that?" He exhaled sharply. "What makes you think this is any different?" Daniel leaned in. "Because this time, they don't know what we know." Ray studied them for a long moment before grabbing the flash drive and sliding it into his jacket pocket. "If this is legit, I'll get it out to my contacts. But if they catch wind of this—" "They won't," Emily interrupted, her voice steadier than she expected. "We have a plan." Ray gave her a skeptical look, but nodded. "Fine. I'll be in touch." As he left, Emily turned to Daniel. "Do you really think this will work?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "It has to. The trap is set." By the next evening, the wheels were in motion. Ray's first report hit the web like a bomb, exposing several shell companies linked to the Dominion. Emily and Daniel monitored everything from a cheap motel room, their nerves on edge with every passing minute. Suddenly, Daniel's burner phone buzzed. He answered, his face darkening as he listened. "They know." Emily sat up straighter. "What?" "They're scrambling to cover their tracks," Daniel said, hanging up. "Langley's called an emergency meeting tonight. They're trying to get ahead of it." Emily swallowed hard. "That means they'll be vulnerable." Daniel nodded. "It's our best shot, but it'll be dangerous." Emily stood, determination in her eyes. "Then let's finish this." The final showdown. The abandoned warehouse where Langley's meeting was set to take place loomed ahead, its rusted exterior barely illuminated by the flickering streetlights. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she and Daniel crouched behind a stack of crates, watching the black SUVs roll in one by one. Daniel checked his gun, his expression hard. "We go in, plant the tracker, and get out. No heroics." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Got it." They moved in sync, creeping through the shadows until they reached a side entrance. Inside, voices echoed off the walls. Langley's unmistakable voice barking orders, demanding answers. Emily could see him now, standing at the head of a long table, surrounded by men in expensive suits. Papers and laptops were scattered across the surface, evidence of their growing panic. Daniel motioned to Emily, and she nodded, slipping around the perimeter of the room while he approached the networked laptop at the far end. She held her breath as he plugged in a small device, a green light blinking once. Just as they turned to leave, a voice cut through the air. "Stop right there." Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. Langley stood, his piercing gaze locked onto them, and a small army of bodyguards closed in. "Well, well," Langley said, his smile cold. "David Carter, I thought you were smarter than this." Daniel stepped protectively in front of Emily. "It's over, Langley. The whole world knows now." Langley chuckled darkly. "You really think this is enough to stop us? We own the system." Emily clenched her fists, but before she could speak, the sound of sirens filled the air. Daniel grinned. "You might own the system, but the people are watching." Police stormed the warehouse, and chaos erupted. Emily and Daniel slipped away in the confusion, their mission complete. A new beginning. Days later, Emily sat on a park bench, staring out at the city skyline. The reports were everywhere now. The Dominion's empire was crumbling, their secrets exposed for the world to see. Daniel sat beside her, reaching for her hand. "It's over." Emily exhaled slowly, a small smile forming. "Not just yet. But we're free now." Daniel kissed her forehead. "And I'm never leaving again." For the first time in 7 years, Emily believed him.